Samuel Rodriguez gripped his mop handle, moving methodically across the courthouse's marble floors. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another janitor, invisible, forgotten. But appearances, as Samuel had learned in his 15 years as an investigative journalist, were the most dangerous lies of all. If you're enjoying this incredible true story of corruption and justice, please take just 30 seconds to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring you more amazing investigative stories like this one. Samuel pushed his cart through the empty courthouse corridors. Hidden beneath cleaning supplies lay his recording device, his lifeline to exposing the truth. And at the center of that web sat Judge Marcus Wellington, the most celebrated jurist in the state, a man whose name was whispered in legal circles with the same reverence reserved for legends. Wellington was untouchable. Harvard Law Review editor, youngest judge ever appointed, media darling, and according to Samuel's sources, utterly corrupt. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, sharp and purposeful against the marble. Samuel didn't need to look up to know who approached. He'd memorized the rhythm of those Italian leather soles months ago. Judge Wellington walked with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered, his presence filling the space around him like expensive cologne. Samuel continued mopping, his movements unhurried, his eyes fixed on the floor as the judge's reflection grew larger in the polished marble. "Excuse me," Wellington's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're blocking the entrance to my chambers." Samuel looked up slowly, meeting the judge's gaze with the practiced deference of a service worker who knew his place. Wellington stood tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair swept back in a style that suggested both dignity and vanity. His eyes, steel gray and sharp as surgical instruments, held the cold assessment of a man who saw people as either useful or irrelevant. "Excuse me." Wellington's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're blocking the entrance to my chambers." "Sorry, Your Honor. I move right away." Wellington's lip curled almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that revealed more than any grand gesture could. It was the look of a man who found the very existence of certain people distasteful, a barely contained sneer that spoke volumes about what lay beneath his public image of judicial temperance. "See that you do," Wellington said, his tone carrying the dismissive authority of someone speaking to furniture that had momentarily forgotten its place. "And in the future, perhaps you could schedule your activities around the schedules of those who actually matter in this building." The words hung in the air like poison, their casual cruelty delivered with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. Samuel felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest, the same righteous anger that had driven him through 15 years of investigative work, through late nights in newsrooms and dangerous meetings with sources who feared for their lives. But he swallowed that anger, channeled it into the performance that had kept him invisible for 4 months. "Yes, sir, Your Honor. I am very sorry. I am new at my job, still learning." Wellington's expression shifted to one of theatrical patience, as if he were demonstrating remarkable forbearance in dealing with such incompetence. "I'm sure you are," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps someone should explain to you that this is a courthouse, not a bus station. Standards matter here. Excellence matters. We serve justice in these halls, and that requires a certain caliber of person." The judge stepped closer, his presence looming over Samuel like a storm cloud. The scent of his cologne, something expensive and European, mingled with the harsh chemical smell of the cleaning supplies. Samuel could see every detail of Wellington's face now, every carefully maintained line, every perfectly placed hair. This was a man who spent considerable time and money crafting his image, a walking monument to his own importance. "Tell me," Wellington continued, his voice taking on the tone he might use when addressing a particularly slow child. "What is your name?" "Samuel, sir. Samuel Rodriguez." "Rodriguez," Wellington repeated, rolling the name around in his mouth as if tasting something unpleasant. "And how long have you been gracing us with your presence, Samuel Rodriguez?" "4 months, Your Honor. I work very hard, clean very good." Wellington nodded slowly, his expression suggesting deep contemplation of matters far beyond Samuel's comprehension. 4 months, he mused. "Tell me, Samuel, in those 4 months, have you perhaps noticed that this courthouse operates on principles of order, hierarchy, and respect? Have you observed that there are people here who serve the cause of justice and others who facilitate that service?"
Samuel felt the recording device in his pocket, its tiny mechanism capturing every word, every inflection. He'd heard Wellington deliver similar speeches before, philosophical dissertations on the natural order of things, thinly veiled lectures about knowing one's place. But never had they been directed at him so personally. Never had the judge's true nature been displayed so nakedly. "I understand, sir," Samuel replied, his voice carefully modulated to suggest both gratitude and confusion. "You, very important judge, help many people." A smile played the corners of Wellington's mouth, the kind of smile a cat might wear while contemplating a particularly interesting mouse. "Indeed," he said, "I am very important, Samuel. I make decisions that affect thousands of lives. I uphold the law, protect the innocent, punish the guilty. My work requires focus, concentration, an environment free from distractions." The judge gestured around them, his hands sweeping across the grand corridor as if blessing it. "This courthouse is a temple, Samuel, a sacred space where the highest ideals of our society are made manifest. Every person who enters these halls should understand their role in maintaining that sanctity. Some of us are priests in this temple, dispensing wisdom and justice. Others—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, his meaning crystal clear. Samuel felt his jaw clench involuntarily, fought to keep his expression neutral. In his 15 years as a journalist, he'd interviewed murderers who showed more humanity than this man displayed in casual conversation. He'd sat across from corrupt politicians, ruthless businessmen, and hardened criminals, but none had possessed Wellington's particular brand of casual cruelty, the ability to dehumanize others while maintaining the facade of moral superiority. "I'm very grateful for job, Your Honor," Samuel said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "I work harder, be better janitor." Wellington's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he detected something in Samuel's tone that didn't quite fit the expected pattern. For a moment, Samuel worried that his mask had slipped, that some trace of his real self had leaked through the performance. The judge studied him with the intensity of a predator who'd caught an unfamiliar scent. "See that you do," Wellington said finally, his voice carrying a warning that went far beyond custodial duties. "Excellence, Samuel. That's what separates the worthy from the expendable. Some people are born to lead, to make the difficult decisions that lesser minds cannot comprehend. Others are born to serve, to facilitate, to remain invisible while their betters do the work that truly matters." The judge checked his watch, a platinum piece that probably cost more than Samuel's actual annual salary. "I have important matters to attend to," he announced, as if his schedule were a matter of public interest. "See that this area remains spotless. And Samuel?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Remember your place." With that, Wellington turned and strode toward his chambers, his footsteps echoing through the corridor like the closing notes of a symphony. Samuel watched him go, counting the seconds until the heavy wooden door closed behind the judge with a satisfying thud. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally, to let the mask slip just slightly. He resumed mopping, his movements automatic while his mind processed what had just occurred. In 4 months of investigation, he'd gathered evidence of case-fixing, bribery, and judicial misconduct that would have been enough to end most careers. But this casual display of contempt, this window into Wellington's true character, this was the kind of moment that would make his story unforgettable. The courthouse began to stir around him as 8 o'clock approached. Lawyers strode purposefully through the corridors, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble. Court clerks hurried past with armloads of files, their faces set in expressions of professional concentration. Security guards took their positions, their presence both protective and intimidating. And through it all, Samuel moved with the invisible efficiency of the truly overlooked, his janitor's uniform serving as the perfect camouflage for a hunter in pursuit of the most dangerous game of all, the truth. As he pushed his cart toward the next section of corridor, Samuel caught sight of his reflection in a glass door. The face looking back at him was weathered by years of chasing stories through the darkest corners of human nature, lined with the accumulated stress of deadlines and death threats. But behind his eyes burned the same fire that had driven him into journalism 15 years ago, the unshakable belief that truth, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous, deserved to see the light. Judge Marcus Wellington had just made the greatest mistake of his distinguished career. He had revealed his true self to someone he deemed too insignificant to matter, too invisible to pose a threat. In his arrogance, he had shown his cards to the one person in the building whose job it was to notice what others missed, to remember what others forgot, to expose what others tried to hide.
Past midnight in his apartment, Samuel listened to Wellington's recorded words for the 7th time, surrounded by stacks of evidence. Wellington's voice filled the small space with its calculated cruelty. Remember your place. Each word was a knife twist, each syllable a reminder of the casual dehumanization that Samuel had endured for months. But it wasn't just the humiliation that kept him awake. It was the weight of everything those words represented. The entire system of corruption that allowed men like Wellington to wield power like a weapon against those deemed unworthy of basic human dignity. Samuel rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar burn of exhaustion that had become his constant companion. 4 months of living a lie had taken their toll. 4 months of biting his tongue when every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to reveal the truth of who he was and what he knew. 4 months of watching Wellington dispense his particular brand of justice while building an empire of influence on a foundation of bribes and backroom deals. The apartment around him told the story of an investigation that had consumed his life. Legal briefs were taped to the walls like some conspiracy theorist's fever dream, connected by red string that traced the intricate web of corruption he'd uncovered. Bank records, case files, and witness statements created a paper labyrinth that led inevitably to one conclusion. Judge Marcus Wellington was not just corrupt. He was the architect of a system that perverted justice for profit. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different beasts entirely. Samuel's phone buzzed against the wooden desk, its screen illuminating with a message from his editor at the Tribune. Rodriguez, need update on courthouse story. Publisher asking questions. How close are we? The cursor blinked expectantly in the empty response field, as Samuel considered how to explain the complexity of what he'd discovered, the delicate balance between gathering enough evidence and maintaining his cover. The investigation had begun simply enough. A tip from Maria Santos, a courthouse clerk who'd worked in the system for 20 years, had led to the discovery of patterns in case assignments. High-profile defendants with expensive legal teams consistently drew favorable judges, while public defenders found themselves before benches known for harsh sentences. What should have been random assignments showed statistical impossibilities that screamed of manipulation. The corruption was staggering, an entire economy where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder. The hardest part wasn't the physical demand of the undercover work, though scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans had given him a new appreciation for the dignity of manual labor. The hardest part was watching the system destroy people while he remained powerless to intervene, bound by the larger mission of exposing the rot from within. He'd watched a teenage drug offender, a kid whose only crime was being in the wrong place with the wrong amount of marijuana, receive a sentence that would destroy any chance of college or meaningful employment. The kid's mother had wept in the gallery while Wellington delivered his pronouncement with theatrical gravity, speaking of tough love and accountability as if he were delivering salvation rather than condemnation. Meanwhile, 3 days later, a pharmaceutical executive facing similar charges walked free after his lawyer made a substantial contribution to Wellington's favorite charity, a charity, Samuel had discovered, that functioned primarily as a money laundering operation. The contradiction aided him like acid. Every day he spent gathering evidence was another day the machine continued grinding up lives, another day Wellington's corruption went unchecked. The journalist in him understood the necessity of building an airtight case, but the human being in him struggled with the moral weight of his inaction. Samuel stood and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The city sprawled before him, millions of lights representing millions of lives, most of them unaware that their system of justice had been compromised by men who viewed the law as a commodity to be bought and sold. How many people were sitting in cells tonight because they couldn't afford the price of Wellington's mercy? How many families had been destroyed by a corrupt system that wore the mask of righteousness? His reflection stared back at him from the window, a man transformed by months of deception. The beard he'd grown for the role made him look older, more weathered. The janitor's uniform hanging on a chair in the corner had become like a second skin, a costume that allowed him to move invisibly through spaces where truth hid in plain sight. But the eyes looking back at him from the glass were his own, carrying the accumulated weight of everything he'd seen and heard. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll dig your own grave." Samuel stared at the message, feeling a familiar chill run down his spine. It wasn't the first threat he'd received. Investigative journalism had a way of making enemies. But this one felt different, more immediate. Someone knew what he was doing, or at least suspected it. He thought of Maria Santos, the courthouse clerk whose tip had started this investigation. She'd been transferred to a different department last month, officially described as a lateral move for professional development. But Samuel had noticed the fear in her eyes during their last brief encounter in the courthouse corridor, the way she'd hurried past without making eye contact. The system had ways of dealing with problems, and those ways didn't always involve legal channels. Samuel's laptop chimed with an incoming video call. His sister Elana's face appeared on the screen, her expression mixing concern with frustration. "You look like hell," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd known him his entire life. "When's the last time you slept, ate something that didn't come from a vending machine?" "I'm fine," Samuel replied automatically, though even he could hear the lie in his voice. "Bullshit," Elana shot back. "Mom's worried sick about you. You haven't called in 3 weeks. Dad keeps asking why you can't just write about sports or restaurant openings like normal journalists." The mention of his parents sent a pang of guilt through Samuel's chest. They'd immigrated from El Salvador with nothing but hope and determination, working double shifts and sacrificing everything to give their children opportunities they'd never had. His mother cleaned houses during the day and offices at night. His father worked construction until his back gave out, then drove a taxi until arthritis made that impossible. They'd scraped together money for his college education, proudly displaying his journalism degree on their living room wall like a medal of honor. "This story is important, Eliana," Samuel said, hearing the exhaustion in his own voice. "It could change everything." "At what cost?" she demanded. "You're killing yourself for what, a story?"
There will always be another corrupt politician, another scandal to expose. But there's only one you, Samuel. Only one brother I have." Samuel looked around his apartment, at the chaos of his investigation, at the evidence of corruption that surrounded him like a fortress of paper and paranoia. Elena was right, in a way. There would always be another story, another injustice to expose. But this wasn't just about Wellington anymore. It was about everyone the judge had crushed under his heel, everyone who'd been denied justice because they couldn't afford to purchase it. "You remember why I became a journalist?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's expression softened. She remembered. They both remembered the day their cousin Miguel had been arrested on drug charges that were later proven false, but not before he'd spent 6 months in jail because the family couldn't afford bail. They remembered the lawyer who'd promised to help for a fee that would have bankrupted the family. The judge who'd looked at Miguel like he was garbage. The system that had treated their cousin as guilty until proven wealthy enough to afford innocence. "That's different," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not," Samuel replied. "It's exactly the same. Wellington and judges like him, they're the reason Miguel spent 6 months in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. They're the reason our parents worked themselves to death trying to afford justice in a system that auctions it to the highest bidder." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of family history and shared pain. Elena's face on the screen showed the internal struggle Samuel knew well. The tension between wanting to protect someone you love and understanding that some battles have to be fought regardless of the cost. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said finally. "Promise me you won't let this story consume you completely." Samuel nodded, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The investigation had already changed him in ways that couldn't be undone. He'd seen too much, learned too much about how the system really worked to ever go back to writing about city council meetings and school board elections. After Elena ended the call, Samuel returned to his desk and opened a new document on his laptop. He began to type not the measured prose of investigative journalism, but something more personal, more raw. "My name is Samuel Rodriguez, and for 4 months I have lived as a lie. I have scrubbed floors in a courthouse where justice is bought and sold like a commodity at market. I have watched a system that claims to protect the innocent instead of prey upon the powerless. I have seen a judge who speaks of honor and integrity while building a fortune on the broken dreams of those who cannot afford his mercy." He paused, his fingers trembling slightly above the keys. What he was writing could never be published. It was too personal, too emotional for the standards of objective journalism. But it needed to exist somewhere, needed to be real in a way that transcended the careful language of news reporting. "Every morning I put on the uniform of invisibility and walk through halls where power masquerades as justice. I have learned that corruption is not just about money changing hands. It is about the casual cruelty of those who believe their position grants them the right to determine the worth of human lives. It is about a system so broken that those charged with upholding it can destroy lives with the same indifference they might show swatting flies." The words came faster now, pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. "Judge Marcus Wellington humiliated me today, reminded me of my place in his carefully ordered world. He sees me as nothing more than a janitor, a functionary whose only purpose is to maintain the pristine appearance of his courthouse temple. He has no idea that I have recorded his words, that I possess evidence of his crimes, that I know the truth about his corruption. But his contempt reveals something more dangerous than simple arrogance. It reveals the mindset that makes his corruption possible."
He closed the personal document and opened his official files, beginning the painstaking work of organizing evidence that would stand up in court and in print. Bank records that showed payments from defense attorneys to Wellington's charity, case files that revealed patterns of favorable treatment for wealthy defendants, Witness statements from court employees who'd been too frightened to speak publicly, but willing to share their knowledge with someone they thought was just another member of the invisible staff. The work continued through the night, fueled by coffee and the righteous anger that had driven him into journalism 15 years earlier. Outside, the city slept, unaware that in a cluttered apartment filled with the detritus of corruption, a janitor who wasn't really a janitor was building a case that would shake the foundations of their justice system. Samuel's phone buzzed one more time before dawn. Another unknown number, another message. "We know who you are." He stared at the words, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in his apartment. The game was changing, the stakes rising. Wellington's world was closing in, but Samuel's investigation was nearly complete. The question now was whether he could finish building his case before they finished building his coffin. The recording device sat on his desk like a small metal witness to the truth. Wellington's voice still echoed in the room. "Remember your place." Soon, Samuel thought, the entire world would know exactly where the judge's place should be. Not on a bench dispensing justice, but in a cell, finally subject to the same system he'd perverted for his own gain. The sun began to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of hope and warning. Samuel Rodriguez, janitor by day and truth seeker by night, prepared for another day of living a lie in service of a truth that could save or destroy them all. The courthouse felt different that Tuesday morning, charged with an electricity that seemed to hum through the marble floors and into Samuel's bones. He had arrived early, as always, but something in the security guard's eyes had changed. A sharpness that hadn't been there before, a way of tracking his movements that made his skin crawl. The threatening messages had escalated over the weekend, becoming more specific, more personal. They knew his real address now, had sent photos of his apartment building, his sister's workplace, his parents' house. The net was tightening, but Samuel's investigation was so close to completion that abandoning it now would mean every sacrifice had been for nothing. He pushed his janitor's cart through the familiar corridors, but the rhythm felt off, disrupted by an undercurrent of danger that made every shadow seem significant. Judge Wellington's courtroom was scheduled to hear the Morrison case today, a pharmaceutical executive accused of bribing FDA officials to fast-track a dangerous drug approval. Morrison's legal team was legendary, expensive, and according to Samuel's sources, had already made significant contributions to Wellington's various charitable fronts. It was the perfect opportunity to document the corruption in action, to capture Wellington's bias on recording in a case that would make national headlines. But as Samuel approached the courtroom, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Detective Ray Castellanos stood near the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd with the methodical precision of a predator. Castellanos was Wellington's enforcer, the man who made problems disappear with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate both sides of the law. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Samuel saw recognition flicker across the detective's face. Not recognition of Samuel Rodriguez, janitor, but recognition of something else, something dangerous. Samuel forced himself to continue his cleaning routine, mopping around the edges of the courtroom as lawyers and spectators filed in. The recording device in his pocket felt heavy as lead, its presence both comforting and terrifying. He had upgraded his equipment over the weekend, knowing this might be his last chance to gather evidence. The new device could transmit in real time to a secure server, ensuring that even if he was discovered, the truth would survive. Judge Wellington entered his courtroom with his usual theatrical flourish, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of some predatory bird. But today there was something different in his demeanor, a tension that suggested he knew something was coming. His eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of a general surveying a battlefield, and when they landed on Samuel, they lingered just a moment too long. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Wellington," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom rose as one. Samuel remained at the edge of the room, his mop bucket and cleaning supplies providing the perfect camouflage for his real purpose. He activated the recording device with a gentle pressure on its surface, knowing that whatever happened next would be preserved forever. The Morrison case began with all the pomp and circumstance that high-stakes litigation demanded. Morrison himself sat at the defense table with the calm confidence of a man who believed money could solve any problem. His lead attorney, Margaret Ashford, was a legal legend whose reputation for winning impossible cases was matched only by her reputation for astronomical fees. Across the aisle, the prosecution team looked like law school students facing off against seasoned professionals. Samuel had spent weeks researching the case, understanding its implications. Morrison's company rushed the diabetes medication to market knowing it caused liver failure in a significant percentage of patients. Over 300 people had died. Thousands more had suffered permanent damage, and the evidence of Morrison's knowledge was overwhelming. This should have been an open and shut case, but in Wellington's courtroom, Samuel knew nothing was ever that simple. The proceedings began with jury selection, and Samuel watched Wellington work his particular brand of influence. His questions to potential jurors seemed routine to the casual observer, but Samuel heard the subtle guidance, the way certain responses were encouraged while others were dismissed. A retired teacher who'd mentioned distrust of pharmaceutical companies was quickly eliminated for cause. A businessman who nodded approvingly at Morrison's success stories was welcomed with judicial warmth. "Mr. Pattison," Wellington addressed a middle-aged accountant, "do you believe that successful businessmen sometimes face unfair scrutiny simply because of their wealth?" The leading nature of the question was obvious to anyone who understood legal procedure, but the prosecution's objections were consistently overruled. Samuel watched the jury pool being shaped into Wellington's preferred configuration, a collection of individuals predisposed to view corporate executives as victims of regulatory overreach rather than potential criminals. During a brief recess, Samuel overheard a conversation that made his blood freeze. Detective Castellanos was speaking quietly into his phone near the courthouse steps, his voice low but carrying in the still morning air. "Yeah, we've got a problem," Castellanos was saying. "The cleaner, he's not what he appears to be. Background check came back clean, too clean. Nobody has that little digital footprint unless they're working very hard to hide something." Samuel forced himself to continue mopping, his movements automatic while his mind raced. They'd run a background check on Samuel Rodriguez, janitor, and found the carefully constructed identity that had taken his newspaper's tech team weeks to create. But if they dug deeper, if they connected the dots between his real identity and his undercover persona, everything would unravel. "We need to handle this quietly," Castellanos continued. "The judge doesn't want any disruptions during the Morrison trial. Too much media attention, too many eyes watching. But after the verdict..." The line went dead, and Samuel felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. He had perhaps hours, maybe less, before his cover was blown completely. The Morrison trial would conclude today. Wellington never let high-profile cases drag out unnecessarily, and Samuel's window of opportunity was closing fast. When court reconvened, Samuel positioned himself near the back of the room, close enough to capture clear audio, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. The prosecution's opening statement was passionate and well-researched, laying out a compelling case against Morrison's company. The lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Hayes, presented evidence methodically, internal emails showing Morrison knew about the liver toxicity, FDA reports that were buried, testimonies from whistleblower scientists who'd been fired for raising safety concerns. But Samuel watched Wellington's face throughout the presentation and saw something that chilled him to the bone. The judge wasn't just biased, he was bored, going through the motions of judicial attention while his mind was clearly elsewhere. This wasn't corruption, this was theater, a performance designed to maintain the illusion of justice while the real verdict had already been decided in chambers lined with expensive lawyers and envelopes full of cash. Margaret Ashford's opening statement was masterful in its manipulation. She painted Morrison as a visionary who dedicated his life to helping diabetics, a man whose company had saved thousands of lives through innovative treatments.
The liver problems, she argued, were rare side effects that occurred in patients who were already severely compromised by their underlying disease. The real criminals, she suggested, were opportunistic lawyers and media outlets who sought to destroy a great man for their own profit. Wellington nodded along with obvious approval, his body language reinforcing Ashford's narrative. When the prosecution objected to several clearly inflammatory statements, Wellington overruled them with theatrical sighs, as if the prosecutors were wasting the court's time with petty technicalities. During the lunch recess, Samuel made a decision that would either save his investigation or end his life. He followed Wellington to the judge's private dining room, a luxuriously appointed space reserved for the courthouse's elite. Using his janitor's access, he entered through the service entrance just as Wellington was settling down for what appeared to be a very private lunch meeting. Morrison was there, along with Margaret Ashford and two men Samuel didn't recognize, but whose expensive suits and calculating expressions marked them as power brokers of the highest order. Samuel positioned himself in an adjacent supply closet, his recording equipment capturing every word of the conversation that followed. "The jury's shaping up nicely," Wellington was saying, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man discussing the weather rather than judicial corruption. "Hayes is competent but predictable, and Ashford's performance this morning was particularly effective. I'd say we're looking at acquittal by Thursday, conviction on the lesser charges at worst." "That's not good enough," one of the unknown men replied sharply. "Morrison needs complete exoneration. His company's stock price is hemorrhaging, and the civil suits won't go away if there's any criminal conviction." Wellington's laugh was cold and calculated. "Gentlemen, I've been managing outcomes in this courthouse for 15 years. Trust me when I say that Thomas Morrison will walk out of that courtroom a free man. The pharmaceutical industry needs leaders like him, men willing to take risks to advance medical science." Samuel felt his hands shake as he adjusted the recording device. This wasn't just corruption. It was a conspiracy that reached far beyond Wellington's courtroom. The pharmaceutical industry had bought not just a judge, but an entire system designed to protect corporate profits over human lives. What about the media attention? Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice tight with worry. "The Times has been sniffing around, asking questions about my charitable contributions." "Handled," Wellington replied smoothly. "We have people who specialize in managing inconvenient narratives. By the time this trial concludes, the story will be about prosecutorial overreach and the persecution of innovative businessmen." The conversation continued for 20 more minutes, laying out a network of corruption that extended into the prosecutor's office, the media, and the regulatory agencies responsible for public safety. Samuel recorded every word, documenting conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice on a scale that dwarfed anything he had imagined when this investigation began. But as he prepared to leave, disaster struck. His foot caught on a supply shelf, sending cleaning bottles cascading to the floor with a crash that echoed through the dining room like gunshots. The conversation stopped abruptly, and Samuel heard chairs scraping against the floor as the conspirators rose to investigate the disturbance. "What the hell was that?" Morrison demanded, his voice sharp with paranoia. Samuel pressed himself against the wall of the supply closet, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain they would hear it. Footsteps approached, and he could see shadows moving under the gap beneath the door. "Probably just the cleaning crew," Wellington said dismissively. But his voice carried an edge of suspicion that hadn't been there before. "These people are clumsy, barely competent for the simple tasks they're assigned." The doorknob turned, and Samuel found himself face to face with Detective Castellanos, whose expression shifted from mild annoyance to sharp recognition in the space of a heartbeat. "Well, well," Castellanos said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "If it isn't our dedicated janitor. Funny thing, though, janitors don't usually need high-end recording equipment to do their jobs." The device was clearly visible in Samuel's hand, its red recording light betraying his true purpose. Behind Castellanos, the lunch meeting had gone dead silent, the air thick with the kind of tension that preceded violence. Samuel's mind raced through his options, none of them good. He could run, but Castellanos was armed and had backup throughout the building. He could surrender, but that would likely mean disappearing into the kind of unmarked grave that swallowed inconvenient truth-tellers. Or he could do what 15 years of investigative journalism had trained him to do: tell the truth and hope it was powerful enough to save him. My name is Samuel Rodriguez. I'm an investigative journalist with the Tribune, and I've been documenting corruption in this courthouse for 4 months. Everything you've said today has been recorded and transmitted to a secure server. Your conspiracy ends now. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle hum of the courthouse's ventilation system. Wellington's face had gone pale, his usual composure cracking under the weight of exposure. Morrison looked like a man who'd just watched his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. But it was Castellanos who spoke first, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to cleaning up messes that couldn't be swept away with conventional means. "No," he said quietly, his hand now resting on his weapon. "Your story ends here, Rodriguez. Some truths are too dangerous to survive." The recording device in Samuel's hand continued its work, capturing what might be the final chapter of an investigation that had consumed 4 months of his life and might cost him everything. But as he stared into Castellanos' cold eyes, Samuel felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, but a strange sense of completion. He'd found the truth, documented it, preserved it. Whatever happened next, the evidence would survive. "You're wrong," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The truth always survives. It might take time, it might require sacrifice, but it always finds a way. And now, the world will know what Judge Marcus Wellington really is." Wellington stepped forward, his judicial robes transforming him into something biblical and terrible. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Rodriguez. This isn't just about one judge or one courthouse. The system you're trying to expose provides stability, order, justice for those who understand how the world really works." "Justice?" Samuel laughed, the sound bitter and harsh in the elegant dining room. "You call 300 dead people justice? You call selling verdicts to the highest bidder justice? You've perverted everything the law is supposed to represent." The standoff stretched between them, charged with the potential for violence that hung in the air like ozone before a storm. I could see calculations running behind Castellanos' eyes, weighing options, considering consequences. The detective was a professional, but even professionals sometimes made mistakes when the stakes were this high.
Outside the dining room, the courthouse continued its daily routine, unaware that in a private chamber lined with mahogany and corruption, the future of justice itself hung in the balance. Lawyers prepared closing arguments, juries deliberated cases, and judges rendered verdicts, all part of a system that had been quietly rotting from within for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Samuel thought of his parents, of Elena's warnings, of Maria Santos, who'd risked everything to provide the first tip that started this investigation. He thought of all the people Wellington had crushed under his judicial authority, all the lives destroyed by a system that treated justice as a commodity to be purchased by those who could afford the price. The recording device in his hand represented more than just evidence. It was a weapon of truth in a war that had been fought in shadows for too long. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, that truth would survive, would find its way into the light, would finally give voice to all those who had been silenced by Wellington's corruption. Detective Castellanos took a step forward, his decision apparently made. But before he could act, the dining room door burst open with explosive force. FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the space, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands that cut through the tension like lightning through storm clouds. "Federal agents, nobody move. Hands where we can see them." Samuel's legs nearly gave out from relief as he realized that his newspaper's legal team had apparently triggered the contingency plan they'd discussed months ago. The real-time transmission of his recordings had reached the federal task force that had been building their own case against Wellington, and the cavalry had arrived just in time to prevent his investigation from ending in tragedy. Agent Sarah Chen, whom Samuel recognized from news coverage of other high-profile corruption cases, stepped into the dining room with the confident authority of someone who'd spent years bringing down powerful criminals. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Judge Marcus Wellington," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law." The words hung in the air like a final judgment, the culmination of months of investigation and years of corruption finally coming to an end. Wellington's face had gone ashen, his hands trembling as the agents moved to secure the scene and process the evidence that would finally bring justice to his courthouse. Samuel Rodriguez, no longer a janitor but revealed as the investigative journalist he'd always been, watched as handcuffs clicked around Wellington's wrists. The judge's eyes met his one last time, filled with hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. "Remember your place," Samuel said quietly, echoing Wellington's own words back to him. But now those words carried a different meaning entirely. A reminder that in America, no one was supposed to be above the law, and that truth, no matter how long buried, eventually found its way to the surface. The investigation was over. The real work of rebuilding justice was just beginning. The FBI field office buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major case breaking wide open. Samuel sat in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and determination, surrounded by evidence boxes, computer screens displaying financial records, and agents who moved with the purposeful energy of people who knew they were making history. Agent Sarah Chen sat across from him, her recorder placed between them like a bridge, spanning the gap between 4 months of careful deception and the moment when truth finally demanded its due. "Let's start from the beginning, Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Sarah Chen said, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd built careers on extracting detailed confessions from reluctant witnesses. Samuel looked around the room, still adjusting to the reality that his undercover identity had been stripped away like layers of old paint. The FBI had known about his investigation for weeks, he learned, had been building their own parallel case against Wellington's network while using Samuel's recordings as a roadmap to the deeper corruption. His 4 months of careful observation had provided the human intelligence that federal surveillance couldn't capture. The casual conversations, the private meetings, the unguarded moments when criminals believed themselves safe from scrutiny. "It started with Maria Santos," Samuel began, his voice hoarse from hours of debriefing. "She was a court clerk who noticed patterns in case assignments, statistical impossibilities that suggested someone was manipulating the system. But when she tried to report it through official channels, she was transferred to a different department and told to keep quiet." Agent Chen nodded, making notes on a legal pad that was already filled with Samuel's revelations. "We've interviewed Miss Santos. She's agreed to testify in exchange for protection. Her information corroborated what we were seeing in our financial surveillance, but we needed someone on the inside to document the day-to-day operations." The irony wasn't lost on Samuel that the FBI had been investigating the same corruption he'd stumbled onto, using resources and authority he could never have accessed as a journalist. But his undercover work had provided something federal agents couldn't: the intimate details of how Wellington's system actually functioned, the personal relationships that made the corruption possible, the human cost of a justice system that had been perverted into a marketplace.
Wellington wasn't just taking bribes, Samuel continued, pulling out a thick folder of documents he'd compiled over months of careful observation. He was running a sophisticated operation that touched every aspect of the courthouse. Bail amounts that corresponded to defense attorneys' charitable contributions, sentence reductions that followed mysterious transfers to his wife's consulting firm,
Even jury selection was corrupted. He had people feeding him background information on potential jurors that never made it into official voir dire. Agent Chen leaned forward, her expression sharpening with interest. "Tell me about the Morrison case. We know from your recordings that Wellington predetermined the outcome, but we need details about how that process worked." Samuel closed his eyes, remembering the casual cruelty he'd witnessed in Wellington's chambers, the way human lives were discussed like stock portfolios to be managed for maximum profit. Morrison's pharmaceutical company killed 300 people, caused permanent damage to thousands more. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails, FDA reports, whistleblower testimony. But Wellington had already decided on acquittal before the trial even began. He pulled out a series of photographs he'd taken with a hidden camera, showing documents from Wellington's desk during one of his cleaning sessions. Bank records, contribution reports, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline for managing Morrison's case through the legal system. The defense made a $2 million contribution to Wellington's educational foundation 3 days before jury selection began, Samuel explained, pointing to the relevant documents. But that was just the visible payment. The real money flowed through shell companies, consulting fees to Wellington's wife, speaking engagements at legal conferences that were essentially money laundering operations. Agent Chen studied the photographs with the intensity of someone who understood that each document represented another link in a chain of evidence that would bring down one of the state's most powerful figures. "How many cases do you estimate were affected by this corruption?" Samuel had been dreading this question because the answer was so staggering it almost defied belief. Wellington influenced at least 300 cases. Anyone who could afford his price got favorable treatment. The silence that followed was heavy with the implications of what Samuel had revealed. 300 corrupted cases meant thousands of lives affected, families destroyed, justice perverted on a scale that threatened the foundation of the legal system itself. Agent Chen's expression showed the weight of understanding that this wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire courthouse. "What about Detective Castellanos?" Agent Chen asked. "Our surveillance showed he was Wellington's primary enforcer, but we need details about his specific role." Samuel's jaw tightened as he remembered the cold calculation in Castellanos' eyes during their final confrontation. He was more than an enforcer. He was the operational heart of the entire system. Castellanos identified potential threats, neutralized witnesses who might cause problems, and coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to protect Wellington's interests. He pulled out another set of documents, these showing patterns of case assignments and transfers that followed Castellanos' interventions. Whenever someone got too close to exposing the corruption, they found themselves facing unrelated criminal charges or transferred to different departments. Maria Santos was just the beginning. There were at least a dozen other courthouse employees who were silenced through intimidation or forced removal. Agent Chen's expression darkened as she reviewed the evidence of systematic intimidation. "We've identified 7 people who were willing to come forward once they learned about federal protection. Their testimonies paint a picture of a courthouse where speaking up about corruption was essentially signing your own termination notice." The door to the conference room opened, and Special Agent James Morrison, no relation to the pharmaceutical executive, entered carrying a box of additional evidence that had been seized from Wellington's chambers. His expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who'd spent months building a case that was finally coming together. "Rodriguez," Agent Morrison said, nodding acknowledgement towards Samuel, "your recordings from yesterday's lunch meeting just gave us everything we need to take down the entire network. Wellington, Castellanos, Morrison, and at least 6 other co-conspirators are looking at federal conspiracy charges that could put them away for decades." Samuel felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. 4 months of living a lie, of watching injustice prevail while he gathered evidence, of enduring Wellington's contempt and cruelty, all of it had led to this moment when truth finally had the power to demand justice.
"What about the victims?" Samuel asked, thinking of all the people who'd been crushed by Wellington's corrupted verdicts, the families who lost loved ones because pharmaceutical executives could buy acquittals, the defendants who received harsh sentences because they couldn't afford Wellington's mercy. Agent Chen's expression softened slightly, showing the humanity beneath her professional demeanor. "That's where your work becomes truly valuable, Mr. Rodriguez. Your documentation of specific cases provides the foundation for appeals, wrongful conviction claims, and civil rights lawsuits that could help reverse some of the damage Wellington caused." She pulled out a thick file containing case summaries that Samuel had helped compile during his debriefing. "We've already identified 47 defendants who were likely sentenced unfairly due to Wellington's corruption. The appeals process will take time, but your evidence gives them real hope for justice." Samuel thought of the teenage drug offender he'd watched receive a devastating sentence while wealthy pharmaceutical executives walked free. Of the families who'd wept in Wellington's courtroom while their loved ones were consigned to cells and criminal records that would follow them forever. The idea that his investigation might help reverse some of those injustices provided a sense of purpose that transcended personal satisfaction. "There's something else," Agent Morrison said, his tone suggesting information that was both significant and troubling. "Wellington's corruption wasn't isolated to his own courtroom. We've uncovered evidence suggesting similar operations in at least 3 other jurisdictions, possibly coordinated through the same network of lawyers and fixers." The implications of that revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. If Wellington's corruption was part of a larger system, if the casual buying and selling of justice extended beyond one courthouse, then everything he'd discovered was just the tip of an iceberg that threatened the entire foundation of American jurisprudence. "How widespread?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "We're still investigating," Agent Chen replied carefully, "but preliminary evidence suggests that this network has been operating for at least a decade, possibly longer. Wellington was a significant player, but he wasn't the architect of the system. He was a very successful franchise operator in a much larger criminal enterprise." Samuel leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of implications that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined when this investigation began. He'd thought he was exposing one corrupt judge, but apparently he'd stumbled on to evidence of systematic corruption that reached into multiple states and federal jurisdictions. The conference room door opened again, and this time it was Samuel's editor from the Tribune, Marcus Webb, accompanied by the newspaper's legal counsel. Webb's expression mixed relief, pride, and the kind of exhaustion that came from managing a story that could reshape public understanding of institutional corruption. "Samuel," Webb said, crossing the room to grip his shoulder with genuine affection, "you magnificent, reckless bastard. Do you have any idea what you've accomplished here?" Samuel managed a tired smile, the first genuine expression of joy he'd felt in months. "I exposed one corrupt judge and nearly got myself killed in the process." "You exposed a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of state government," Webb corrected, his voice carrying the excitement of an editor who knew he was sitting on the story of a lifetime. "The Tribune's legal team has been coordinating with the FBI to ensure that our coverage doesn't interfere with the federal investigation, but once the arrests are complete, we're looking at a series that could run for months." The newspaper's legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, spread out a series of documents on the conference table. "We've already received preliminary approval from the FBI to publish your initial story, with certain sensitive details redacted until the investigation is complete. But Samuel, this isn't just about one newspaper story anymore. This is about fundamental reform of how judicial corruption is investigated and prosecuted." Samuel looked around the room at the agents, lawyers, and editors who had become the unlikely coalition working to expose the truth he'd risked everything to uncover. The teenage drug offender whose harsh sentence had haunted him, the pharmaceutical executives who'd purchased acquittals with other people's lives, the courthouse employees who'd been silenced for trying to speak truth to power, all of them would finally have their stories told. "What happens to Wellington now?" Samuel asked, thinking of the judge's final expression of hatred during his arrest. Agent Morrison consulted a briefing sheet that outlined the immediate next steps in the federal case. He's being held without bail pending a grand jury indictment. The charges include conspiracy, bribery, civil rights violations under color of law, money laundering, and racketeering. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at life in federal prison. The poetic justice of Wellington's situation wasn't lost on Samuel. The judge who dispensed harsh sentences to defendants who couldn't afford his mercy now faced the same system he'd corrupted, but this time without the protection that money and influence had provided for so long. "There's something else," Agent Chen said, her tone suggesting news that was both significant and personal. "The federal task force wants to offer you a consulting position on the expanded investigation. Your understanding of how these corruption networks operate from the inside could be invaluable as we work to identify and prosecute similar operations in other jurisdictions."
Samuel considered the offer, weighing the opportunity to continue fighting institutional corruption against his exhaustion from 4 months of living undercover. The investigative journalist in him was intrigued by the possibility of exposing corruption on a national scale, but the human being in him craved the return to a normal life where he could sleep without wondering if tomorrow would bring threats, violence, or worse. "Can I think about it?" Samuel asked, and Agent Chen nodded understanding. As the debriefing session concluded and the various law enforcement officials and legal professionals began filing out of the conference room, Samuel found himself alone with Marcus Webb, his editor, and the man who'd supported his investigation even when it seemed impossibly dangerous. "You know," Webb said quietly, "when you first proposed going undercover in the courthouse, I thought you were either brilliant or completely insane. Turns out you were both." Samuel laughed, feeling some of the tension of the past 4 months finally beginning to release. "I'm still not sure which one predominated." "Does it matter?" Webb asked. "You've accomplished something that most journalists only dream of. You've used the power of truth to bring down corruption at the highest levels of government. Wellington's arrest is going to send shockwaves through every courthouse in the country." Through the conference room window, Samuel could see the FBI field office continuing its work, agents and analysts processing evidence that would reshape the legal landscape for years to come. His recordings, photographs, and careful documentation had provided the foundation for a case that would not only bring justice to Wellington, but potentially expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond anything he'd initially imagined. The thought of the teenage drug offender and all the other victims of Wellington's corrupted justice filled Samuel with a sense of completion that transcended personal satisfaction. Their voices would finally be heard, their stories finally told, their suffering finally acknowledged by a system that had failed them so profoundly. Judge Marcus Wellington, who commanded respect through fear and corruption, who treated human lives like commodities to be bought and sold, who looked at Samuel with contempt and told him to remember his place. That judge now sat in a federal holding cell, facing the same justice system he had perverted, but this time without the protection that money and influence had provided for so long. The janitor's uniform that had been Samuel's disguise for 4 months now hung in his apartment like a costume from a play that had finally reached its dramatic conclusion. But the story it represented, the story of truth overcoming corruption, of justice delayed but not denied, of one man's decision to risk everything for the sake of exposing institutional rot, that story would continue to resonate long after the headlines faded and the trials concluded. 6 months later, Samuel stood before the courthouse wearing a press credential instead of a janitor's uniform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps where protesters had once demanded justice, and where families of Wellington's victims now gathered to witness the final chapter of a legal saga that had captivated the nation. Inside, the courtroom that once had been Wellington's personal theater of injustice had been transformed into something resembling actual justice. Federal District Judge Elena Vasquez, appointed specifically to oversee the corruption trials, commanded respect through competence rather than fear. Her reputation for fairness and integrity had been earned through 2 decades of principled service, and her presence represented everything Wellington's courtroom had failed to be. The prosecution table was crowded with federal attorneys who had spent months building cases against not just Wellington, but the entire network of corruption his investigation had exposed. Lead prosecutor David Chen, Agent Sarah Chen's husband as it turned out, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that justice delayed was about to become justice delivered. At the defense table, Wellington looked diminished, his once commanding presence reduced by the weight of federal charges and the loss of the power that had defined his identity for so long. The expensive suits had been replaced by standard courtroom attire, the theatrical confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in methodical legal stages. Samuel found himself thinking about the teenage drug offender whose devastating sentence had haunted him throughout his investigation. Marcus Williams, 19 years old, had been released from prison 3 months ago after his conviction was overturned based on evidence of Wellington's corruption. The young man's mother had written Samuel a letter that now hung framed in his apartment, a reminder that behind every story about institutional corruption were real people whose lives hung in the balance. "The relief I feel," Mrs. Williams had written, "knowing that my son's future hasn't been stolen by a corrupt system is something I can never adequately express. But more than that, I feel hope that maybe the system can work the way it's supposed to, when people like you are willing to risk everything for the truth." That letter represented one of 47 convictions that had been overturned or were under review based on evidence from Samuel's investigation. 47 people whose lives had been derailed by Wellington's corruption, whose families had been torn apart by sentences that reflected bank account balances rather than criminal culpability. The appeals process continued, but each successful reversal represented a small victory against the institutional rot that had infected the justice system. Judge Vasquez called the court to order, her voice carrying an authority that was earned rather than assumed. "We are here today for the sentencing of Marcus Wellington, who has been convicted on 14 federal charges, including conspiracy, bribery, civil rights violations under color of law, money laundering, and racketeering. Before imposing a sentence, I will hear statements from the victims whose lives were affected by the defendants' crimes." The victim impact statements began with Maria Santos, the courthouse clerk whose initial tip had started Samuel's investigation. She walked to the podium with the dignity of someone who had risked her career to expose corruption, and her voice carried clearly through the courtroom as she addressed the man who had tried to silence her. "Judge Wellington," she said, looking directly at the defendant, "you created a culture of fear in our courthouse where speaking truth was treated as betrayal. You made us all accomplices to your corruption by forcing us to choose between our jobs and our consciences. But today, truth has finally found its voice, and justice has finally found its way." One by one, the victims came forward, defendants who had received harsh sentences because they couldn't afford Wellington's mercy, families who had lost loved ones to dangerous pharmaceuticals because executives could purchase acquittals, courthouse employees who had been transferred or terminated for asking uncomfortable questions about suspicious patterns in case assignments. Each statement was a dagger thrust into Wellington's carefully constructed image of judicial righteousness. His face remained impassive,
but Samuel could see the muscle in his jaw working as victim after victim described the human cost of his corruption. This was the reckoning Wellington had avoided for 15 years, the moment when the invisible people he had crushed under his authority finally had the power to speak their truth. When the victim statements concluded, Prosecutor Chen rose to address the court. His presentation was methodical and devastating, laying out the scope of Wellington's corruption with the precision of a surgeon exposing a cancer that had metastasized throughout the body of justice. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "Marcus Wellington violated the most fundamental trust that society places in its judges. He perverted justice for personal gain, sold verdicts to the highest bidders, and treated the courthouse as his personal marketplace where human lives were commodities to be bought and sold." Chen gestured toward the evidence boxes that lined the prosecution table, each one representing months of painstaking investigation that had built an unassailable case against Wellington and his co-conspirators. The defendants' crimes resulted in wrongful convictions, unjust sentences, and the systematic denial of constitutional rights to hundreds of defendants who couldn't afford to purchase favorable treatment. The prosecutor's voice strengthened as he reached the heart of his argument. "But perhaps most troubling of all, Your Honor, is the culture of corruption that Wellington created and sustained. He didn't just take bribes, he built an entire system that rewarded dishonesty, punished integrity, and taught every person who worked in that courthouse that justice was for sale to anyone with sufficient resources." Samuel felt a familiar surge of the righteous anger that had driven him through 4 months of undercover work and 6 months of testimony and trials. Wellington's corruption had been about more than money. It had been about the fundamental perversion of everything the legal system was supposed to represent. Wellington's defense attorney, a competent but overmatched public defender named Robert Kim, rose to make his client's final plea for mercy. It was a thankless task, defending a man whose crimes were so well documented that the only remaining question was the severity of his punishment. "Your Honor," Kim said, his voice carrying the resignation of someone arguing an unwinnable case, "my client acknowledges the serious nature of his crimes and the harm they cause to individuals and to the justice system itself. He asks the court to consider his previous 15 years of service on the bench, his contributions to legal scholarship, and his expressed remorse for his actions." It was a standard mitigation argument, but Samuel could see from Judge Vasquez's expression that such considerations carried little weight against the overwhelming evidence of systematic corruption. Wellington had shown no remorse during his trial, had fought each charge with the arrogance of someone who believed himself above the law he had sworn to uphold. When Kim finished his plea, Judge Vasquez turned to Wellington himself. "Mr. Wellington, you have the right to address the court before I impose sentence. Do you wish to make a statement?" Wellington rose slowly, his movements stiff with the weight of defeat and impending judgment. For a moment, Samuel thought the former judge might finally acknowledge the harm he had caused, might show some recognition of the lives he had destroyed in pursuit of personal enrichment. Instead, Wellington's statement was a masterpiece of deflection and self-pity. He spoke of the pressures of judicial service, the difficult decisions that judges were required to make, the complexity of cases that defied simple moral judgments. He portrayed himself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach, a dedicated public servant who had been destroyed by political enemies and sensationalistic media coverage.
"I have devoted my life to the law," Wellington said, his voice carrying echoes of the theatrical authority that had once commanded his courtroom. "Every decision I made was guided by my understanding of justice and my commitment to upholding the rule of law. If my interpretation of those principles has been called into question, I maintain that my intentions were always honorable." Samuel felt his jaw clench as Wellington continued his self-serving speech, refusing even in defeat to acknowledge the reality of his crimes. There was no apology to the victims whose lives he had destroyed, no recognition of the institutional damage his corruption had caused, no acceptance of responsibility for 15 years of systematic abuse of power. Judge Vasquez listened to Wellington's statement with the patience required by due process, but her expression showed no sympathy for his attempts at self-justification. When he finished speaking, she consulted her notes briefly before delivering a judgment that would define the final chapter of Wellington's legal career. "Marcus Wellington," Judge Vasquez said, her voice carrying the authority of legitimate judicial power, "you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the very heart of our justice system. As a judge, you held a position of ultimate trust in our society. Citizens who appeared before you had every right to expect fairness, impartiality, and adherence to the rule of law. Instead, you transformed your courtroom into a marketplace where justice was sold to the highest bidder." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Vasquez continued her remarks, her words carrying the weight of institutional condemnation. "Your crimes were not momentary lapses in judgment, but systematic and sustained violations of your oath of office. You corrupted not just individual cases, but the entire system of justice in your jurisdiction. You taught everyone who worked in your courthouse that integrity was negotiable, and that power could be abused without consequence." Judge Vasquez's final words echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of an era. "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel's sharp crack punctuated the sentence, and Samuel watched as Wellington's shoulders sagged under the weight of justice finally delivered. As court officers led Wellington away in shackles, Samuel caught a glimpse of the man's face, no longer the arrogant judge who had commanded fear and respect, but a broken figure whose empire of corruption had crumbled beneath the weight of truth. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and quiet sobs from victims' families who had waited years for this moment. Outside the courthouse, Samuel faced a sea of reporters and cameras. The story had captivated the nation, inspiring similar investigations in courthouses across the country. 3 other judges had already been arrested based on leads generated by Samuel's initial exposé, and federal task forces were examining judicial systems in 12 states. "Mr. Rodriguez," a reporter called out, "what's next for you? Will you continue investigating judicial corruption?" Samuel considered the question carefully. The past 10 months had aged him, but they had also renewed his faith in journalism's power to create change. "The truth is like water," he replied, thinking of his parents' struggles and his sister's warnings. "It always finds a way to flow around obstacles and reach the light. My job is simply to help clear the path." Maria Santos approached him as the crowd dispersed. The courthouse clerk, who risked everything to expose the first hints of corruption, now worked for the federal task force, helping to identify and investigate similar operations nationwide. "Thank you," she said, simply, her words carrying the weight of all those who had suffered under Wellington's corrupted system. That evening, Samuel returned to his apartment and carefully packed away the janitor's uniform that had been his disguise for 4 months. He hung it in his closet like a reminder of the invisible people who keep society functioning while the powerful play their games above. The story would continue. New investigations, new revelations, new battles between truth and corruption. But for tonight, Samuel Rodriguez, investigative journalist, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in almost a year. Hope that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still prevail when ordinary people refused to accept that power placed anyone above the law. The courtroom would reopen tomorrow with new judges, new procedures, and new hope for genuine justice. What an incredible journey this has been. If Samuel's courage to expose corruption inspired you, please like this video, subscribe for more amazing true stories, and let us know in the comments what story you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth always finds a way